It is my pleasure to introduce Lisa Monaco, the Deputy Attorney General of the United States. I have the pleasure of knowing Lisa 20 years, which is hard to fathom since it all happened in a flash. Also because she seemingly does not age. She looks exactly the same. So whatever she's eating, I'm not getting that. Lisa is like a rank overachiever. It's really annoying. She's, a kid out of Boston. She went to a local community college called Harvard, and then moved on to the University of Chicago Law School. I think the first early signs of her overachieving was her law school internship, wasn't at the legal clinic downtown, it was in the office of the White House counsel. This becomes a clue as to how she moves forward. After that, working in the Department of Justice, she was involved in the prosecution of a white-collar matter. It was called Enron. That caused her to win the Attorney General's Achievement Award in 2002, 2003, 2005, and then there was still space left, so they gave her the Attorney General's Award for Exceptional Service. But in that case, in Enron, somebody who came out of Harvard and Chicago Law School and was deep into white collar, met a Department of Justice person who was leading that effort named Robert Mueller, who then ended up, as events would have it, just days before 9/11, having the fortune or misfortune, given the timing, of being appointed director of the FBI. And that's where I met Lisa. Bob brought her in, and eventually she became his chief of staff. And from there to the Department of Justice, with a criminal portfolio, national security portfolio, cyber portfolio, and from there to the White House. Like others we've talked about, she's served Republicans, she's served Democrats. She is a career public servant and a person who has literally been at every place at the moment that it was the most challenging time to be there. Let's welcome Lisa Monaco. Yeah, no, they're still trying to get it back. Okay. I always loved Charlie Rose because you could tell when he had prepared for an interview or not prepared for an interview by the first two questions he asked.
Which one is this one going to be?
Let me start, you'll know. Lisa, what is it about you that makes you you?
Did I say it's dangerous to give John Miller a microphone or to let him introduce you?
Yes.
I was getting bored back there just listening.
Well, you'd heard the story before.
Yes.
So, for framing purposes, given the subject, the title of the conference, the audience, where are we at this moment in the sphere of the threat picture for the United States?
Well, look, as I'm sure you've heard from folks, including the terrific panel that just finished, we are at a very, very elevated time across a whole range of threats. But before I address that, I should say it is just a real privilege to be here, to sit next to you, John, my former colleague, as you mentioned, and as I just said to Ali backstage, a real treat to be here, and particularly at this time. And I really want to thank the Soufan Center for holding this summit and for welcoming me. I think we are at a place with regard to the threat picture where it's more diverse than any other time that I've seen and experienced in my time in the national security and law enforcement community. And I don't say that lightly, right? We have gone from a time where we were appropriately focused on core al-Qaeda and stopping the next 9/11 style attack to one where we are facing a real, basically, cauldron of risk from foreign terrorist organizations, international terrorism activity, domestic terrorism activity. And I think the game changer here currently, John, is the work of nation states, projecting power both at home and abroad, and that is a real change in the threat picture from my prior role in the White House as Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Advisor to today. And, you know, I think about, I've been a consumer of the President's daily brief for, you know, going on 20 years now in the various roles, all of which you mentioned in your introduction. And I've seen a real evolution, and of course from focusing on all CT all the time. And you know, when I was Homeland Security Advisor, met with the President every single morning along with the National Security Advisor, the DNI, and I would spend a lot of time early in the morning thinking, how am I going to use this time with the President? And early on in my tenure, it was all CT all the time, as you might imagine. Interestingly, as I evolved and as the years wore on, I left that role at the end of 2016 and the beginning of 2017, spending more time with him on cyber threats by nation states than on CT. I come back now in 2021 to be a consumer of the PDB again. And of course, we've got a very dynamic terrorism threat, cyber threats, but the change is nation-state actors, state-sponsored actors, and their proxies really just penetrating the threat picture all across a whole range of threats.
You know, the diversity of the threat will throw you these curveballs. I can remember my first, I don't know, Commissioner Bratton, our first month in the NYPD, and we had Ebola. And I mean, you know, you kind of looked down your panel of experts and said, who do you call when you have an outbreak of Ebola coming from far? I called the White House. I got Lisa Monaco, and I'm like, so Ebola, what do you got on that?
Yeah.
And she put us together with national resources very quickly. But let's drill down on the nation states.
Yeah.
Nation states what? Nation states how? Because we talked about Iran in the last panel, which is kind of a shocking development. Operators on the ground, plots to kill people, senior people. But what about that, and who others?
So the change in the volume and the intensity of the Iranian threat and the Iranian lethal plotting is one of the most significant developments in the threat picture that I've seen in the last several years. Now, it's not new. You and I are both old enough to remember Abarbsiar.
That's what I said.
Christy Abizaid, if she's in the audience, would take exception to what you just said. 2011 plot by Iran and the IRGC to use a cutout, Mr. Abarbsiar, to kill the then Saudi ambassador to the United States, Adel Jubeir, at Cafe Milano. It's like
by
using
a Mexican drug cartel hit team.
Exactly right. So it was like a plot out of a movie, but it was the first time we saw this crossing of really a red line by plotting to kill individuals here in the homeland. Due to incredibly great work by the prosecutors and agents, including folks here in New York, of course, that plot was disrupted. But that wasn't the last of the Iranian plotting. And of course, after the death of Soleimani, we saw an increase in intensity and volume of the lethal plotting. But again, due to incredible work by JTTF, by agents and prosecutors, the intel community, foreign law enforcement partners, we've now been able to disrupt a whole series of these plots. Plots against former National Security Advisor John Bolton, plot to kidnap and murder an Iranian dissident journalist here in New York. Again, shout out to NYPD, incredible work working with the JTTF on that case.
That was my last day.
Really? Nice job. And of course, yesterday, we announced additional charges against a Pakistani national with ties to Tehran, plotting here in the United States to kill U.S. officials on U.S. soil. So what we are seeing is a relentless effort by Iran and Iranian proxies to project power here in the United States, and they are quite determined. But I will tell you, John, as long as they're at work, we're going to be at work to stop those plots.
So let's dig into that, which is, we kind of picture on the ground agents and investigators put together the case. You know, they delivered in a package to DOJ. But the role of DOJ's involvement in this has evolved.
Yeah. So it's really something I'm incredibly proud to have witnessed and been a part of over now a series of years. And we have been relentlessly executing on a strategy that says we are going to be intel-led, threat-driven, focused on using every tool of national power to go after and disrupt threats. We're going to bring cases and prosecutions if that's the right tool to use to disrupt that threat, but we're also going to lend our intelligence, our information from those investigations to aid our partners in using their tools to disrupt that threat. Disruption is the name of the game. Prosecution is one tool in that, and it has been an exceptionally effective tool, as we have shown time and again. Again, last week, we showed that we've got a long arm and a long memory with regard to the charges we announced against Hamas, right? Ever since the horrific events of October 7th, we've been relentlessly investigating both the murders of Americans and kidnapping of Americans there, but also what those charges showed is documenting decades-long mass violence efforts by Hamas. And that, of course, has built on a long history of bringing the most impactful cases, and I'm not just pandering to the local audience here, so many of those cases, if you look back, have been centered here in New York with tremendous prosecutors from SDNY, from EDNY, from partners in New Jersey, from state and local partners across the board. And all of them, of course, have an international component. And you could go down the list, Najibullah Zazi, the Rahimi case, again and again, the West Side Highway case, all across the board just last week. The case against, again, a Pakistani national trying to cross the border from Canada, working with our colleagues at RCMP to disrupt that case. He's now facing extradition for trying to plot against a Jewish community center here on the anniversary of October 7th. So it has been a story of using every tool, using intelligence, fusing that with criminal prosecutions, using that to disrupt threats wherever they emerge, and then taking the information we gain in those criminal cases and, again, feeding it into that intelligence cycle, all about disruption, disruption, disruption.
I want to focus here at home again for a minute with a slight pivot. We are, a month and a half out from a presidential election. We're probably in the most brittle political time since either before the Vietnam War or before that, maybe Lincoln. We have a presidential candidate who has already survived an assassin.
Lincoln, who you knew.
Yes, yes. I covered him when I was starting. Presidential candidate who has survived an assassination attempt, a lot of rhetoric coming from operators on both sides. We live in a post-January 6th world. How, as Deputy Attorney General, does DOJ fit into a process where there's going to be allegations, there's going to be controversy, and now we've entered the realm of violence too? Yeah.
Another distinguishing feature of the last couple of years in the threat picture is an unprecedented and exceptionally disturbing rise in threats against public officials. And I think it is a function of exactly the environment that you just so succinctly summed up. We have seen an unprecedented rise in threats of violence and actual violence against public officials, from law enforcement to prosecutors to judges to, of course, election officials. And it is something that I've never seen before in my history in law enforcement and national security. And it's outrageous, right? People who are being threatened simply for doing their job. And it's unacceptable, and we have made it a priority to bring case after case to demonstrate that we won't tolerate that. And particularly with regard to, you mentioned the election season, what we have seen is a rise in threats against election officials. We launched an election threats task force a couple of years ago to respond to this, because what we're seeing is a real potential impact, because people are being threatened and intimidated from doing that job. Oftentimes, what we're talking about here, yes, they're elected officials, secretaries of state who are responsible for administering elections, but what we're also talking about, John, is simply volunteers. These are people who volunteer to help all of us exercise the most fundamental right we have, the right to vote, the right that protects all the other rights. So these are volunteers being intimidated from doing their job. It's unacceptable. We've brought now over 700 threats cases over the last 2 years. More than half of those involve threats against public officials, including election workers. So we are trying to demonstrate that it's unacceptable and people will be held to account regardless of the flavor of their threat and regardless of their motivation, and it crosses the political spectrum.
So then going back out internationally, you know, we see these hidden hands in foreign places that are pulling all kinds of levers. One of the latest reports from one of those cases in the documents described Iranian efforts at election influence where they had done a number of things, but the one that fascinated me was they had created news sites to attract left-wing audiences and then other news sites to attract right-wing audiences, and then they had stolen articles from the internet that were getting a lot of traffic on Google to make sure that people gravitated to their sites, but they had put them through AI so that it would change the phrasing and the words around so they wouldn't be accused of plagiarism. Terrorism's okay and fixing an election, but plagiarism's a problem. And I remember raising the question, well, if they're moving to left-wing consumers and right-wing consumers, who are they favoring? And the answer was they don't favor anybody. They're trying to stir the pot. They're trying to sow division. And this was Iran.
Right. So we know that, and let me say, the Director of National Intelligence, I think, is doing a tremendous public service by documenting and being very transparent about what we in the intelligence community are seeing with regard to foreign malign influence campaigns. She has done so in the intelligence community, working across the intelligence community to include what we at the Justice Department and the FBI are seeing. And she has been putting out, and the intelligence community has been putting out publicly very clear descriptions of what we're seeing, from Russia to Iran to China to other actors. And what we are seeing is very aggressive efforts. We've documented a number of those. So with regard to Russia, just last week we announced charges against RT and an Orwellian-named organization, the Social Design Agency. So these are Russian-backed and Russian government efforts to, yes, sow discord, to seek an outcome, frankly, consistent with what they were doing in 2016, to use AI, to use unwitting commentators here in the United States to push Russian-backed narratives. We are also seeing it with Iran. I gave a speech in August to try and really amplify what we are seeing. And I said then, and this was before the horrific assassination attempt on the former president, I said very explicitly then, Iran is trying to influence our presidential election. We know they are doing that as well. China is looming quite large in this space as well. They are also getting into the game, not with respect to picking a particular side in the presidential election, but trying to influence some down ballot races. So what we are seeing is a very aggressive set of activities for foreign malign influence campaigns, and all of it is being accelerated by emerging technologies, namely AI.
So I just want to close with a question about, now that we've heard all the dynamic things that the Department of Justice, Homeland Security, FBI are doing, and across so many other agencies, not to exclude the NYPD, all together on this. There was an article in Foreign Affairs by Mike Morell, the two-time acting director of the CIA, former deputy director of the CIA, as you would remember him, you know, a presidential briefer with the PDB, and Graham Allison from Harvard. And the crux of the article was, we are at September 10th again. All lights are blinking red. In Moscow, a mall was burned to the ground and people were killed. There was a terrorist attack in Iran by ISIS at Soleimani's memorial service. That propaganda being fueled like, rocket fuel from the events going on in Gaza is extolling American lone wolves to take up arms and kill people coming from ISIS-K and affiliates. And that with everything you described, the Russia problem, the China problem, the Iran problem, that CT resources have thinned out because they're being spread against all these other real threats. Are we up to the task? Are we resourced enough? Are we ready for whatever the next 9/11 would look like?
So a few things on this. First, Michael Morrell is an exceptionally thoughtful analyst. I've spent a lot of time around the Situation Room table with Mike, so I'm always going to be listening to what he has to say. When it comes to resourcing, as the chief operating officer of a huge organization that operates around the world with more than 115,000 employees, you're never going to get me to say that we don't need more resources. Absolutely, we do. And the diversity of the threat picture that we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, John, means that all of those threats are competing for time, attention, and resources from policymakers, from the operators. So it is absolutely a challenge, and we're doing so in a really just divisive environment that makes it hard for folks to really focus on the task at hand when they're being attacked for simply doing their job. So that is no doubt a challenge. But what I would say is we are not at 9/10, right? We are well past that in the following respect. We have built the tools owing to the tremendous work that's present in the people here and the many, many people who stand literally and figuratively behind all the leaders that you'll see on this stage. We've built up the muscle memory. We've built tools like the JTTF model with its gold standard being right here in New York at the very start. We've built a apparatus that is singularly focused on disruption, on being intel-led and threat-driven. So I think we are in a very different place than we were on 9/10, thanks to a lot of incredible work across multiple administrations. But we cannot take our eye off the ball, off the international terrorism ball, off the fact that we now face a generational impact on the threat from October 7th and its aftermath. So I think the biggest danger, in addition to the diverse threat picture, is one of complacency. We can't be there, and one of distraction in a very divisive political environment. But I'm optimistic, given the tools that we have and how I have seen them be relentlessly and professionally used over many decades.
Well, Lisa, first of all, even to talk to you, given the expanse of your responsibility and the sophistication of everything you're involved in, required somebody who had the depth and knowledge and experience to even ask these questions. They couldn't get him, so I got to actually do this. And we'll thank Lisa Monaco.
Thank you very much.
Thanks
very much.